welcome everyone for coming to today's webinar. My name is Jamie Morgan-Besser and I work for the Australian Red Cross National Recovery Team. We are so happy to have you today for our webinar, which is entitled Community Activism, Supporting Your Community During Disaster Recovery. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar is being presented by Australian Red Cross, and our recovery program is based upon the Australian National Disaster Recovery Principles and draws upon the Community Recovery Handbook, research from the Beyond Bushfires Research Program, as well as our own domestic and international experience. It also contributes to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction with a focus on building back better. Now, Red Cross has been supporting the recovery of rural, regional, urban and Indigenous communities post-disaster since 2006. Red Cross's disaster recovery programs are all hazard, consequence focused and work closely with local services, all levels of government and community groups. As a result of this community-led approach, all of our recovery programs are reflective of the communities that we work with, and we add value to recovery processes through having a trusted, neutral, independent role within communities that draws upon our unique experience, including from other Red Cross national societies, business and community organisations. Now, following the 2019-2020 bushfires, Red Cross has committed to a 3-year recovery program across New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I would just like to cover a few housekeeping topics. As always, today's webinar is being recorded and we will share a link to the recording with you after the event is complete. And we welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share with your network. There are also other webinars which we've hosted in the past, specific around community recovery development and disaster recovery that we welcome you to revisit. We also invite your comments and questions. So you can see a chat box there and our lovely host, Jessie, will be facilitating those questions. Now, if you do think of a question for our guests at any point, just type it in there and Jessie will either pose it at the time if it's appropriate or hold it to the discussion portion after each chat. But listen, today we are very, very lucky. We are joined by Kris Newton and Crestani. Now, Kris Newton is the manager of the Mountains Community Resource Network and has been since March 2012. And following the 2013 Blue Mountains bushfires, she chaired the Wellbeing Psychosocial Recovery Subcommittee and is chairing the current Health and Wellbeing Subcommittee. She is now a permanent observer representing the community sector on the Blue Mountains Local Emergency Management Committee. Very exciting stuff. And obviously, the work that she does at the Mountains Community Resource Network advocates strongly for the critical need for community voices. Welcome, Kris. Now, Anne is the manager of the Step-by-Step Recovery Support Service, which provides psychosocial disaster recovery support to impacted communities in the Lithgow, Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury regions. Now, following the devastating bushfires in the region in 2013, workers from their local welfare and community services sector stepped up to create the step-by-step team. Excuse me. Now, with funding from state government and the local Uniting Church Synod, Step by Step provides support to over 520 Blue Mountains households during a 9 months of operation. Now, the program, with the success that they've had, has grown on the expertise of all of the Australian community workers and services that has gone before them, and sets the benchmark for supporting communities after disaster. And as I mentioned, we're so lucky to be joined by Jessie Heward, who is the Red Cross New South Wales Disaster Recovery Coordinator, and she joins us today to facilitate our panel. So please, ladies, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Kris and Anne, thank you as well for joining us to share your experience and your knowledge. Let's jump straight into it. I'll hand over to you, Kris.
Thanks, Jess, and welcome everybody. We're sitting here, Anne and I, today on the lands of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, amazing local Indigenous groups, and we thank them for their care of the land over many eons and acknowledge that it was never ceded and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I've got 2 key points to make, I suppose. One is that I want to talk briefly about what I call the 3 R's. So I see that as a continuum of response and relief, recovery and community resilience building. And those are not separate elements. Recovery starts the moment a disaster hits, as everyone who's ever been involved in disaster recovery knows. And those are integral elements, all connected. So resilience building is one of the key core competencies, I guess, of the community sector, what we see as our core business, and it's integrally related to preparedness and to recovery, because it's a resilient community. And we've been hearing so many stories out of Australia post Black Summer, post COVID, about particularly regional communities who are incredibly connected and incredibly resilient, recovering from the multiple disasters that have affected them this year. So in the Blue Mountains, we did some early research after 2013, and it gelled exactly with all of the international and national research, which basically said that resilience is essentially, if you drill right down into it, the result of the direct correlation with the number of connections people have with family, friends, neighbours and community. So that was the jumping point for all of the work that we've done subsequently in response, recovery and resilience building. So I have, my second point has 5 what I'm calling key principles for what does community-led recovery, response and resilience look like. So point number 1 is that, in my view, we need to put the community back into community-led. Sadly, it's often not the case that the community is at the heart and the core, their voices actively sought and listened to, and a wide diversity of the community involved. So whether that's people who are particularly vulnerable for one reason or another, frail-aged in the current COVID environment, obviously, but also, as we found for bushfires, whether that's people who have pets, people with a disability, LGBTIQ communities, cold communities, children in particular, and young people are often left out of the conversations. So, for example, children are often assumed to be spoken on behalf of by their parents, teachers, or other adults in the community, but children have a voice of their own, and we need to make efforts to go and find out what their views are, what they want to see in terms of recovery. So all of the work that we do is based on essentially the Harwood Community Conversation Model, and that's really just a methodology for going out and engaging and listening carefully to the voices of community, what they want to say in terms of their own recovery, what they need. And we found from 2013, as Anne will testify, that each individual community or village in the Blue Mountains had a completely different view about what they wanted in terms of, say, commemoration or anniversary activities, about what they wanted as a priority restoration for local infrastructure, for example. We know that by talking to them, by finding out what they need and offering our assistance rather than doing it for them, that is inevitably going to have a better outcome. So put the community back into community-led. So principle number 2 is that governments, whatever level and whatever their goodwill, cannot do recovery, especially long-term recovery. There are a variety of reasons for this. Often they lack the trust of community, and the old expression of "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you" is not a joke for no reason. A lot of community members see their council, and often, frankly, regional and rural councils see themselves as the other 3 R's, the roads, rates and rubbish, and they don't see community development, community recovery, except in terms of basic infrastructure and clean up and so forth, as part of their core business. So it's important that whoever does the recovery needs to have the trust of the local community. That's a given. And part of the reason for that is that they lack the one thing that the community sector and community groups and community organisations have, and that's conduits to and from the grassroots of the local community. So it's not always easy for governments at any level to be able to say, I know what the people of fill in the blank, the name of the town, the name of the village, need and want, because I've been there over a long period of years with my ear to the ground, hearing what the local residents are saying is their requirement. So that's an essential missing piece, I think, in the work of government. There's an entire one of these webinars conducted with Steve Pascoe on behalf of the Red Cross recovery team, and he makes this point very clearly and very articulately, and in the package of information that comes out to you after this webinar, Jess will make sure that Jess and Jessie will make sure that you get the link to that webinar. I do strongly recommend it because it highlights the work that two local communities, one Strathewen after the 2009 Black Saturday fires in Victoria, and latterly the community of Malacata, who liked the model of Strathewen and asked Steve to come and help them navigate their way through to a similar kind of outcome for their own community. Another reason why governments are not ideally placed to do any of this resilience building or recovery is that because they're a bureaucracy, they are a bureaucracy. They're slow, they're not nimble. It's like turning around the Titanic. And we saw that certainly here in New South Wales with the COVID pandemic, is that local community sector organisations were able to completely pivot all of their service delivery and their service activities to their local community within the space of about a week, I think, on average. State government took a great deal longer, even local government took weeks because of the infrastructure and the IT systems, and all perfectly understandable, but slow. Another reason why governments aren't ideally placed is that they are frankly risk averse. Despite the fact that they, at all levels of government, actually fund community service organisations, they seem to believe that we're going to be profligate, improvident, or generally fraudulent, and their go-to place, their default space, is to give it to large national organisations, and there may be advantages in terms of internal systems and fiduciary responsibility, but then the downside is that you get that bureaucratic break on activities. They also tend to, in certain levels of government and certain stripes of government, believe that the market will solve problems. I don't know about anybody else, but I think I live in a society, not an economy. And it's extremely unusual in our perception for private enterprise organisations to be able to do the work that we do in community, because again, they suffer from much the same bureaucratic sloth as governments do. Next, they tend to be, sadly, still quite paternalistic. We're from the government, we're here to help you. And to take over. And many communities who have gone through a recovery process with a state government organisation have dubbed that process the second disaster. In some cases, it feels like being rolled over by a steamroller. Not all cases, I hasten to add, and most state government bureaucracies in particular are really moving to change, but that movement is inevitably slow. And in summary, they lack genuine engagement with the community. Another old joke of mine is that consultation is when governments come and tell us what they're about to do to us. basically. It's not about finding out what the local community wants. So principle 3 is that I hasten to add, in counterpoint to my second principle, that governments are committed, they're passionate, they are concerned, they really want to help. This is not a criticism of the people who work in state government recovery agencies. They are amazing, hardworking, work till they drop people who are passionately committed to recovery. But their best role, frankly, is in offering guidance to those, especially to those undertaking recovery for the first time, to give them support, to give them referral to people who might be able to assist with their own perspective because they've done something similar in the past or struggled through similar situations. And they can certainly provide professional support and ideally resources, because that's one of the things that we desperately lack. So in summary, my version of the old lead, follow or get out of the way is to just draw a line through lead and put, in terms of government's role, follow or get out of the way. Fourth principle is that community leaders and groups and organisations are in fact the best placed to be involved in all three of those 3 R's, response, recovery and resilience. And the reasons for this are simple. It's that they're the trusted, go-to local place-based organisation. They're locally managed, they're embedded in their community at the most basic grassroots level. That they are able to be nimble and pivot as quickly as required. They know their local community intimately. That is, they know who the local leaders are, who heads up the grapevine, quicker than email usually, that person. How trusted is the local school principal, COP, PNC, CDW member, CWA member. Who are the gatekeepers? Is that the local hairdresser, the local service station? You know, who's who in the zoo at the local level, and who are people who are not there just to self-aggrandise or grab a bit of glory, but are actually passionately committed to their local organisation. Sometimes the gatekeepers might be feed suppliers, there might be insurance agents, there might be the coach at the local sporting club. Locals know who they are. Community sector organisations in particular, their core business is asset-based community development. And when we say asset-based, we mean what are the strengths in the local community that the local community can build on for their recovery to enhance their resilience. It's not about coming in and doing things to community. It's not about we know best for your community. It's about taking the strengths of the local community and utilising them to help climb that steep slope that is recovery. And of course their core business is also serving the most vulnerable in community, and they understand trauma. Anne's going to talk a bit more about that later. So they're best placed to have the conversations, to undertake the consultations, to do the needs analysis in a recovery environment. And no other sector, none, has this level of grassroots engagement or the two-way communications conduits. So two-way between community and government, for example, at various levels. And I want to finish off with a quote from David Crosby, who says that community service organisations need to plan for a much more prominent role in national policy formulation, not because we have needs, but because we have the solutions. And governments need to resource us to do that work effectively. Part of our difficulty here is that community service organisations and community groups, for that matter, are doing all of this on the smell of an oily rag and goodwill. So far in the Blue Mountains, with the exception of the step-by-step or its equivalent recovery support services, the psychosocial recovery has seen no money from state or federal governments as yet. This is nearly 8 months in. This is too long. In order to be able to do this effectively, we need to be resourced. we get penalised by our state government or federal government funders, for example, if we don't meet their KPIs, but there's no, generally, COVID's been an exception, there's no recognition that doing essentially full-time work in the community on recovery and building resilience needs any additional resources. It's business as usual as far as government is concerned. So I want to mention two things. I've already mentioned the link to Steve Pascoe's webinar, and I highly recommend listening not just to that, but to Anne Edbeater and all the other webinars on this recovery channel for Red Cross YouTube. But also, Jamie will send you a copy of the Bushfire and Climate Plan. Many of you may be aware that a few weeks ago, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Change, that's the group led by Greg Mullins of previous emergency chiefs and commissioners around the country, the Climate Council and the Australian Council of Social Services Network joined together to do some really important work. Anne and I, for example, and I'm sure quite a few of the people on this webinar as participants were also participants in the round tables. The one that Anne and I were involved in was the one in relation to community-led recovery. It's the last chapter, I think, of this report, and I highly recommend it to you as good reading. If you're interested in the intricacies of firefighting and why we need our own large aircraft water bombers, then there are other chapters that are relevant to that. But my concern is particularly the final chapter in relation to the role of community service organisations. Governments keep saying, the rhetoric is community services organisations need to be at the centre, they need to lead, and I'm saying let us do that, that's our job, but we need to be resourced to do that. So yeah, over to you, Jess. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Kris. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat panel or in the Q&A box. We've got two that were asked during the time that you were speaking. So we had one from Margaret, which is addressed to both yourself, Kris, and Anne. Do you think that large NGOs are now also dropping in trust with communities? Do large NGOs and governments now both need to adopt a supporting role with local communities and community-based leaders and organisations leading? So she's very interested in your opinion.
Do you want to go first, Anne?
No. No,
Excuse me.
I will, you know, surf your wave, Kris.
Okay, thanks. So the first part of the question, Jess, could you repeat that again to me, please? I should be looking at this in the...
No, it's in the chat panel, so it's moved on a bit. It was, do you think that large NGOs are now also dropping in trust with communities?
To be honest, I think it depends on the NGO and what they're actually doing in the local community. So I think Anne would agree with me that our experience both following 2013 and following this year is that the NGOs that we've been involved with have given us for 12 months at least, so Red Cross, for example, the Salvos, have provided local people on the ground to local community, and that's the key. If someone had been coming from the Red Cross, forgive me, Jess, but from Melbourne with no idea of the Blue Mountains local community, that would not be a particularly helpful activity. Whereas having folk come to be in our local community to help us do the recovery rather than take over the recovery is not an issue for us. On the other hand, I have to say that one of my pet hates is when governments give large amounts of money to large national NGOs to, for example, set up another call centre. you know, the feedback from, and there's a recent report on this, but the feedback from regional rural Australia anyway, is that if they want mental health support, they want that primarily at the local level. It's great to have access to a call centre in a crisis at 11 o'clock at night when there's nobody else available. But what they want to do is to build a relationship long-term with a counsellor they trust who can walk them through the issues. And that's not, I think the big issue with communities, local place-based community service organisations, is that they can squeeze a penny till it squeaks. You know, we're so used to operating on the smell of an only rag. What we could do with millions would defy conception. I don't know that it's the best use of government money to always give it to large national NGOs when there is suitable expertise in the local community. If there isn't, by all means, you know, provide support to the local organisations to build capacity, to upskill, to provide, you know, mobile connectivity, whatever is required to the local community, but don't come in and do it for them. Come in and upskill them, because as we all know, disasters aren't getting any less frequent or any less extreme. We need our local communities upskilled and have the capacity to deal with these in the future.
Can I just drop in? Thank you. I'm now going to surf on Chris's very shiny, glittering wave. Look, I think from my perspective and in my current experience, if you like, that I think relationships and credibility are absolutely key, particularly when people are most vulnerable. And we know that, you know, with all of the media backlash against the big providers, obviously, who are there providing recovery grants, etc., that actually relationships are built up from the individual to individual and then grows from there. So I think relationships and credibility can be built at any particular level, but they do take time to build. And ideally, that needs to happen before disaster events. After a disaster event, it's pretty hard to build that credibility and trust rapidly and quickly. So I think, once again, echoing what Kris was saying, the benefits of place-based community orgs is essentially they have those runs on the board with the community already, and you know, quite a few coins in the trust piggy bank there that we can draw upon. So I think it's very much comes down to relationships, but as we all know, the best relationships take time to build.
Exactly.
And I think you have talked a bit about whether or not large NGOs and governments now both need to adopt a supporting role with allowing local community-based leaders and organisations to lead the work. So I think
that is, in my view, their function.
Yeah.
To support, to resource, to advise, to give guidance, to put you in touch with other people who've done it, but not to do it. That is not their role. Yes, I wish it did too, Kiki. I just saw Kiki's comment in there.
Oh, yes. Yes, Margaret. Absolutely. We agree.
There was a second question that was posed by Stephen, and that is, are there best-in-class templates, how-to guides available to enable small and remote communities to better lead the creation of community emergency plans, something to fit the gap of what council should or could be leading?
My response to that is, I don't believe so yet. I'm only speaking for New South Wales, not for any other state, and there may well be different views. I know that what's now Resilience New South Wales has commenced a series of small pilots. We're involved in a few of them around some of those issues. So we have here a community resilience network pilot, which is basically a collection of names and contact details on a page at the moment. Hasn't really done a great deal, much more than that. Mind you, we haven't had a chance to with the the last 8 months that we've had, or more actually. But I think the problem is that recovery is complex, and each community will be completely different to each other community. I think governments would like a cookie cutter approach where you can just tick the boxes in the template and, oh, cool, you know, we're on our way to recovery. I wish it were that simple, but sadly, not in my experience anyway. There are 2 mentoring processes which Jess might want to talk about, one with the Red Cross and one with this Australasian Women in Emergencies network, designed to help fill this gap. So to be able to talk to somebody else who's been through a similar kind of experience or faced similar kind of hurdles, so that you can find out what they did that didn't work, and why, and, you know, get some ideas of somebody who's been through it and is coming out the other side. But I don't think there's an easy how-to guide as a template, no.
I would just add to Stephen, in terms of actually plans around community emergency management plans, I'm not sure where you are, Stephen. There are programs that are run. I know that SES previously did a program, and that up in northern New South Wales, we've actually supported a program Red Cross has called Community Action Teams. And that's all about the local community that know that they get isolated, particularly during flooding in the ones that we've worked with so far, and the emergency management plans that they put in place when the fires happened, because this was something that was done prior to the fires. They were actually able to feed information into the local emergency management response. So there are some projects and processes in place to develop emergency response processes, but not always the whole recovery space.
So one of the other pilots we're involved in the Blue Mountains is with the local emergency management committee. It has a standing subcommittee called the Resilience and Recovery Subcommittee, and we have been actually working on exactly that, and thank goodness we did, because we finalised it in November and then we started having the bushfires, so that was extremely timely for us. Yeah, so there are certainly some examples where with or without government, local communities, and, you know, I point back to Kinglake, Strathewen and so on in the wake of the Black Saturday fires. Many of those communities have developed their own plan for recovery, but, you know, and Malacata and others following this season. But I'm not aware of any guide or template that helps you figure out how to go about doing that.
Thanks, Kris. There are a couple of questions. So we had a question, I think it was from Celeste. In terms of trust, do you feel that the community feels that it is trusted by the different organisations who seek to support them?
The local ones or the blow-ins?
That wasn't clarified. Perhaps if you answer from both perspectives.
I think I've probably already answered for the local ones. I believe that, generally speaking, local community sector organisations have very high levels of trust with their local community. They might not necessarily be known very well by all members of the community, but they are trusted. In terms of organisations from outside, clearly it varies. You know, to take the Red Cross as an example, our experience following 2013 was so positive, and the Red Cross volunteers in the Blue Mountains helped us tremendously with the outreach work that they did, you know, door knocking, making sure that people were okay, making sure that they knew that there were services and supports available for them, and bringing back to us as the wellbeing group trends about what they were seeing out there in terms of mental health, for example, or the vexed question of trees, which always comes up after every fire. But I mean, it goes right back to Anne's point. It takes time to develop trust and a relationship. So organisations coming in from outside who have not already got that relationship, it's significantly more problematic, at least in my experience anyway. Anne?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think step by step, Mark 1 and Mark 2, so we're at it for the second time around this time, we wouldn't be able to do the work we do unless we had a complete and utter confidence in the capacity of the people that we're working with. So in terms of trust, yes, that's a given. That's part of our philosophy. It's part of our clinical practice model. And so, if you like, our clinical practice model hasn't deviated at all from what we normally do in-house, and we just translated that into disaster recovery. And that is that strengths and capacity approach. And unless you have trust and trust at the heart of that, you're not going to be anywhere near as effective as you need to be.
Which goes back to the issue of governments funding large, for example, NGOs to come in and do recovery, is that because they don't have that relationship, they don't necessarily have the trust of the local community either. I mean, trust the local community. So if the local community says, no, we don't need a new pipeline for X, what we really want is a bird bath, should such a thing happen, they need to be able to trust that the community knows what they actually need and want. And if they don't have that relationship, how are they going to do that in a short turnaround? It's tricky. I'm sure there are organisations who can do it. Probably, as Anne has said, if they've already got that as their core business model, yes, it might be possible to do that in a short turnaround in a local community they don't know. But I imagine it would be tricky.
Thank you both. I might ask Jamie Morgan-Besser to jump in quickly and talk a little bit about the drama, which is the Red Cross mentoring program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessie. I wonder if you can hear me okay. The Disaster Recovery Advisors and Mentors Australia program, of which our wonderful Kris is a steering committee member and a mentor, is just based on that idea of we've got people such as Kris and extremely extraordinary others who have gone through the disaster recovery process again and again, and have been, you know, community leaders in their own towns, and have essentially got hard-fought wisdoms and learnings and understandings, and it's being able to articulate all of that wisdom and knowledge and sharing it with people such as the people that are on, you know, some of our audience members who are going through this situation and going, what is disaster recovery and why am I feeling so tired? Why does it feel so hard? And to have someone, you know, as a mentor on the other end of the phone, just to go, I don't understand exactly what you're going through, but this is what I went through when, you know, this fire came through my community, or this flood came through my community. And just to tell a story about this is what we did, it kind of gives people that there is hope on the other side, that there is a recovery on the other side of it. And it just kind of normalizes the experience of recovery. So, you know, our mentors have got one-on-one relationships with people who want to engage, which is fantastic. But we're piloting some sessions with communities in Victoria at the moment around mentoring with our disaster mentors with communities. So I think it was mentioned earlier around, where are we? We said here, Paul was making the comment, I think, around your community groups and just not knowing where to go. Some of our communities in East Gippsland, and Kris touched on it with Steve Pascoe and the work that he's been doing in Malacata, just kind of went into Malacata a couple of weeks after the fires happened and just told a story about what happened to him and his community in Strathewen in 2009. And just showed people what was possible around advocating for yourself and that sort of thing. So it's just walking beside people on this recovery journey and just normalizing the recovery experience. But I might talk to it a little bit later, Jessie, about how people, if they're interested, can contact us to get involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. There are a couple more questions. And we'll go through the last 4 questions that I've seen, then we might move on to Anne's session so that we don't run out of time. I'm sure there will be plenty more time for questions afterwards. So we have a question from Maddie, who was wondering if you have any words about the role of a year-round community development in building social and emotional resilience to climate change?
Yes, so basically core business of the community sector. And it's not building resilience just to climate change, in our view. It's building resilience, period. Because resilience is resilience, it's the same thing. So whether it's, you know, a personal loss and grief, that could be your pet, or it could be, you know, a loved one in your family, whether it's a divorce, loss of a job, whatever the shock or setback might be, whether it's a disaster or not, takes the same set of skills. And one of our other disaster mentors, Rose Glassick, who was the senior psychologist, still is with the Department of Education, but particularly following the 2013 fires, talks about building resilience muscles in exactly the same way as physical health and well-being. We need to walk, swim, do yoga, do weights, whatever, to build up our physical muscles. We need to do the same thing with our resilience muscles. We need to practice. So community development work, that is what we do. That's basically building support networks around people, particularly vulnerable people. So my next door neighbour's 96, bless her, lives mostly on the top floor of her 2-storey house, still toddles out and goes in the taxi to do her shopping. But she's got a little network of people around her, some who come to see her on a regular basis, volunteer home visitors, and just her neighbours who kind of look out for her. And when the fires were on, you know, it's community. And so the combination of building resilience skills, some of them are specific to preparedness. So we want to make sure that anyone who's got a smartphone and is interested knows how to use it for more than just a phone. You know, there are apps you can download, including ones from the Red Cross and the SES and the RFS and so on. You can get your radio, your ABC local radio, your emergency broadcaster on an app. So to make sure that people have the skills and the supports that they need to be more resilient in their lives in total. So that's the question.
I think so. Thanks, Kris. We've got a question here, and you may understand it might be a little of a local context question, or we might need to ask Paul for a little more information. It said, did the Blue Mountains Emergency Plan include the mounts, with a capital M? If so, how?
Yes, Paul, it would have, because the mounts are all in the Blue Mountains LGA up to and including at least one half of Skyline Road in Barami that Anne's going to speak about later. How no different to any other village in the mountains, I don't believe. I mean, all of the mounts have their own RFS brigade. Most of the able-bodied people in those villages are members of the brigade. Many of them also have a community fire unit, so that's just a group of neighbours who get together with a pump that they can attach to the nearest hydrant to help save each other's houses if necessary. I think the Blue Mountains plan in terms of emergency firefighting is not much different from one village to another. It will be different when you get to the two small towns, so Springwood and Katoomba, obviously, but most of the other villages are essentially strung out on the top of the ridges in our ribbon development in the Blue Mountains, which unfortunately means that they're also probably overlooking the flame zone. And most people in the Blue Mountains live in very close proximity to the bushfire interface, which was what makes us the most fire-prone populated part of the planet, sadly.
Thanks very much, Kris. There are two more questions. I think they're really great questions. So I'd like to ask them before we move on to Anne's section. So we have one from Michelle, which is, how can you convince governments, so state government or state recovery mechanisms, not to hire the large NGOs to come in and do recovery work? And I thought this was a great question because it really lends itself to that idea of advocacy.
So, you know, if you find the answer, Michelle, let me know. I've been advocating on this with increasing levels of passion and frustration since 2013, and I think I am getting a little traction, and others like me in, so you'll meet Sarah O'Brien shortly, and Anne, and many others around the country. But I think it needs a whole community groundswell. So from disaster-affected communities in particular, or disaster-prone communities, I suspect that governments have the tendency to think that when we say this, that is we, the community sector, it's a bit, you know, poor me, crying poor stuff, rather than a genuine plea to resource us to do this properly for our own local community that we know. So I think it's up to academia, it's up to large NGOs like the Red Cross, and I know they're doing this, Salvos are certainly doing this, to organisations, local business who aren't necessarily directly involved with community services, to put this point of view to their local emergency management committee, to their local council, to ask their local council to advocate up to state and federal governments that this needs a change. It's all very well to talk about shared responsibility for emergencies, but we need a bit of the shared resourcing going around too. So I don't think this is something that the community sector can do on its own. It's obviously been fairly unsuccessful to date. We probably need all of your help to do this.
Well, I also mentioned that representation from the peaks, they have been largely absent. And I think, you know, if your service is a member of, you know, one of the numerous peaks, we need to be putting pressure and pushing upwards and saying, you know, we need formal representation at emergency planning, at levels of emergency planning. The other thing I was going to say, and I will highlight this in my presentation, is that we need to be less humble and less invisible in the work that we do. And when I get to my presentation, I'll back that up with basically that the state government funded recovery support services are actually made up of community service organisations. And we're going to all do an amazing job, and we need to actually promote that and publicise that far and wide. But first and foremost, one of the main things is to get our peaks on board with this. If we can't get representation through our peaks, then, you know, we're individual services pushing as hard as we can.
That's a very good point, and thank you for raising that, because it has been an issue. Certainly we in the Blue Mountains have been pushing our statewide peaks since 2013 to say, you know, this is an issue. It's an issue for a neighbourhood centre or a youth service or a family support service, whether you want them or not, whether you've thought about it or not, whether you're prepared for them or not, your local community is going to turn up on your doorstep in their hundreds looking for your support. And our sector is completely unprepared for that. We're completely unprepared for our own services, or we were before 2013, for our own services to be impacted. So very few services in the mountains were using cloud storage for all our data, our clients' information. You know, who has the key? Who's got the authorization from the board to be able to close the service down if you're in the path of something? Simple things like that. But also we weren't preparing our local community. So we were doing what we do in resilience, but it wasn't resilience and including in the context of disasters. So we weren't necessarily the go-to place for recovery, response, resilience, we were resilience. Our local community knew and trusted us, but they didn't necessarily see us as the first point of call for the response phase. So yes, good point. So can I strongly suggest that if you're a member of the LCSA, of FAMS, of Western Sydney Community Forum, of NCOS, or your equivalent in your own state, that you agitate for your peaks to be advocating on your behalf to get the support and resources that we all need to be able to do this work for our community.
Thanks very much, Kris. And we had one last question before we move on, which was from Evelyn. And how does a community lead its recovery when so much of the disaster has affected their work and their lives and they're tired and worn out?
Well, exactly my point. So we need governments to recognise and to resource this. So we need the capacity in small community organisations to be able to backfill your position. If your prime work now is on the recovery or on building a more resilient community, you need to be able to continue business as usual. I know from personal experience, and so does Anne, that doing 2 full-time jobs over a couple of years does tend to take it out of you eventually, and we cannot keep this up, and we can't ask our staff and our volunteers to do this either. It's not fair, is the simple answer. So we need to agitate, and that means when opportunities come around, not just for $20,000 here or $15,000 there or $5,000 there for a grant, but genuine funding through Category C funding, for example, we need to be agitating for our local services to have the capacity to backfill, to have flexible community grants so that local community groups can apply for activities that they know are needed on their local patch, their village, their town. We need professional supervision support for staff and volunteers who are facing vicarious trauma day after day. There's a whole range of things that we need support for, and we cannot do this, frankly, on the pathetically small amount of funding we get from government to do what they see as our core business.
Yeah, can I also mention on the back of that at a really practical level, we're a medium-sized community org, and we did the recovery back in 2013 and are doing it again, but across a much bigger geographic area. That, and I'm just tapping into Rob from Kempsey mentioned that they've set up a multi-agency recovery hub. Now, on a really practical level, if there's capacity for the community services network or the local sector to pull together, to pool resources, to set up something like, a multi-agency recovery hub is definitely the way to go. No one service should have to cover everything. And I know that can be difficult, particularly in more remote areas where you might only be the only community service around for miles. So that can be really challenging. But I think if there is capacity for your local network to come together to plan how will we do this before the next disaster event happens, once again, it's that, assets assessment and audit where you can go, oh, okay, well, this service specialises in children and young people. This service is an Indigenous service, this service over here. How are we all going to work together to provide something like a multi-agency hub? So on a really practical level, that's a great way when everybody's time poor, resource poor, to actually pool the resources for the community.
Exactly. And Jess, can I just add in response to Natalie, I think it is, talking about the peaks being locked out of certainly I think in New South Wales, being locked out of the disaster management discussions, that they're not allowed at the table, essentially. I think part of the problem is that the peaks have been approaching government on a one-on-one basis. I think the only way to achieve this, I suspect, let me say that if in New South Wales the CEOs of NCOS, FAMS, Youth Action, LCSA and Western Sydney Community Forum made an appointment to see Shane Fitzsimmons as the Head of Resilience New South Wales and put this to him, that they might get a hearing. at the moment, they're not getting a hearing. It sounds like, you know, poor me.
Great. Thanks very much, Kris, and thanks, Anne. Anne, we'll pass on over to you now and hear from you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody, so fingers crossed the technology works, so just hang in there. Okay, just let me go to slideshow. I hope everyone can see that. Look, thank you, Jess and Jamie, for organising today and for inviting Kris and myself. And you know, this is so affirming to me of the stuff that, you know, Kris and myself and Jessie, of course, have been banging on about for years now. So it's really great to have another opportunity to meet with you all and speak with you, or at least give our sort of perspective on where we think change can potentially happen. Now, I've changed the topic of my presentation to talk about the new wave, and I'll talk through the logic behind that in just a minute. But I'll just give you a tiny bit of background about myself. As Jamie mentioned earlier before, I was first involved in disaster recovery following the catastrophic fires in the Blue Mountains in 2013. And this is my second tour of duty, so to speak. And I must say that I am pleased that I've had the experience to, and some of the skills and the hard-learned lessons to apply into this second experience of disaster recovery, if you like. So I've called it the new wave because I believe that change is in the air in how recovery is managed. And I'll say that from the background of back in 2013, which is now 7 years ago, you know, talking about psychosocial recovery was really quite a new thing in terms of the larger emergency management and recovery entities, if you like. And even involving a local community organisation in assisting a community in their recovery was fairly new. And it was even considered, believe it or not, slightly radical. So I'm slowly seeing change, and I know change can be incremental, and it certainly is. But I'm saying that on the back of, I believe change is in the air, and there is a new wave in terms of how disasters will be managed in the future. And I think as the community services sector, I think we need to be riding that wave and maybe even having an influence on the direction of that wave and where it ends up. So a change is in the air, and I'm saying that on the basis of the rollout of recovery support services across New South Wales. Now, many of these services, and they're called recovery support services, and they've been funded by Resilience New South Wales, have actually been drawn drawn from local community organisations, that is place-based community organisations. And they are populated by workers from the local community. And so I think this is a large-scale recovery. And I think really, I see that as affirming and acknowledging that community organisations, place-based community organisations, and we're not all big community organisations. You're going to hear from Sarah and Pauline as part of this presentation. And neither of them are working in or managing, you know, really large NGOs. They're small to medium-sized and very much embedded in the community. So I would have to congratulate Resilience New South Wales from that perspective, that obviously what they've experienced, not just in the Blue Mountains in 2013, but also in Dungog in 2015, up in Lismore with the floods up there, they're learning lessons. They're actually seeing what the community services sector is capable of. And what we're capable of is producing really excellent outcomes for communities that have been impacted by disaster events. So I guess, you know, this is all stuff that you already know, but by choosing local community organisations to, if you like, to, you know, provide that level of support to their disaster impacted residents, means that they're tapping into a joined up services system. And we know a joined up services system works well to address community trauma and the inevitable social ruptures. We're seeing lots of social ruptures in the regions that we're working in. So at the moment, Step by Step Recovery Support Service is one of 7 recovery support services working in New South Wales. Step by Step is actually auspiced by Gateway Family Services. And we're, as I mentioned, we're a medium-sized place-based community or family support service. So we're currently covering Mid-Western, Lithgow, Hawkesbury and Blue Mountains regions, which is a huge geographic region. But we're working with communities where the impacts have been very widely dispersed and into many, if you like, geographically isolated communities. We're seeing a lot of social ruptures. We're seeing, if you like, fragmentation within the community, and only embedded community responses are going to help heal some of those relationship ruptures. So the other thing that Resilience New South Wales is tapping into is, you know, the sharing of the resources, the intel, the community programs that are emerging, that the local neighbourhood centres are developing and rolling out within their community. And it's all about inclusive practice, of course. So we're really, really, if you like, mindful of whose voice isn't being heard. You know, who's falling through the gaps. So, you know, we advocate strongly for and with community, and as I mentioned before, what we're about is tapping into those existing community assets and resources. We're all about focusing on the capacity. So as you know, as Kris has mentioned before, the recovery process is often protracted, very messy and very unpredictable. So as Kris mentioned before, a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter method is just not going to work. There are communities within communities. No community is homogenous, and we're certainly not finding that in the large regions that we're working in. Each community, each street, if you like, each neighbourhood has its own specific needs. So I think this is the importance of having that intel on the ground, having that first-hand knowledge about what disparate communities need and what they want, and to provide platforms for them to have a voice, if that makes sense. So there was a question that came up before, I think, when somebody said not all community sector orgs are connected with the community at the grassroots level, and that's absolutely right. So I guess really it's about finding out where those connection points are in the community, both formal and informal. So I can tell you from Step by Step's perspective, one of the best ways and most effective ways that we found of actually linking in and finding out who in the community has been impacted but hasn't put their hand up to say, hey, I've lost my home, is through those local community leaders that Kris mentioned before. And I'm going to share a story with you in a minute about how valuable that is. So you don't even need to have a specific footprint into in a particular community to be able to, if you like, get some connections in there. So you can see that recovery is very long and drawn out. And as a result that, you know, place-based community orgs, you're there for the long haul. And so people are going to continue to tap in with you and your services for the long haul, even after all of the official, if you like, recovery support services have either gone back to the substantive roles or are just wound up. So just tapping back into the national principles of disaster recovery, I think they align really nicely with those principles of community development and empowerment that we've been talking about. And the national principles of disaster recovery are about understanding the context, recognising complexity, using community-led approaches, coordinating all activities, communicating effectively, and recognising and building capacity. So if that's not actually the principles in which place-based community organisations actually operate from as part of their business as usual, I'd be very, very surprised. So you can see that those national principles of disaster recovery, and I would go as so far as to actually suggest that they have pulled from principles of community development. So that's once again another affirmation of, or at least a recognition that principles around community development and empowerment need to actually guide and drive recovery. Okay, so Kris has already talked about this. Basically, you know, you're here for the long haul, but to do this work, you need to sustain your service and sustain your core business to meet increased demand. And to do this work, you need to be recognised and resourced. So that's that point that Kris and myself have been banging on about for the last 7 and a bit years. The other really important thing, and I hope I'm not moving too fast, but I'm just really mindful, I want to leave time for Pauline and Sarah. The other really important thing, Pauline and myself were talking about this yesterday, is that all aspects of recovery need to be based on trauma-informed practice, or we need to have trauma-informed disaster recovery at every level. And I think that place-based community organisations have that as, you know, a basic operating framework and principle. Most community orgs basically, if not, if you like, completely immersed in trauma-informed practice, at least they have some knowledge and awareness of what it means to be trauma-informed. And because we are operating in such a complex, unprecedented recovery environment with the overlay of COVID-19, and now going into what's probably likely to be a very deep financial recession with all of the, with all of the impacts of that there is so much trauma in the community. Just very quickly, an example is most of the steppers, as we call them, from the step-by-step team, when they first visit with a resident, second visit, third visit, fourth visit, a lot of that visit is spent with, if you like, the resident talking through their stories of what happened on that day, or what happened on that week, or the build-up of weeks before the fires actually came through. There is a lot of significant trauma in the community. And so that needs to be met with a trauma-informed approach, and community organisations are well-versed and have good expertise in that particular approach. So I'm going to share a couple of quick stories with you now about community collectively crafting their own bushfire recovery. So I'm going to talk about the Skyliners, and that's looking at crafting bushfire recovery at the neighbourhood level, and also very briefly the Malacata Recovery Committee, and that's crafting their own recovery at the community level. So essentially the Skyliners are a wonderful group of residents that the steppers, a couple of steppers are working with in the Mounts, in the Blue Mountains. So Skyline Road was a road in Mount Tamara in the Blue Mountains, which was very heavily impacted and has been impacted a lot in the past by bushfires. And basically, the step-by-step worker met with one of the residents there, who is one of those informal community connectors, if you like, one of those informal leaders. We were able to help him on a really practical level. We were able to get funds to replace his laptop that was lost in the fires, and he's dependent on that for his business. And as a result of that, he decided to host a morning tea, and he invited everybody in his street. Now, a good proportion of the people in his street had lost their homes in the bushfires. So we had a very informal morning tea, and myself and the other step-by-step worker, Amanda, was there, and we just chatted over cups of coffee and delicious cake. We were very well fed. And as a result of that first meeting, they decided they were going to form a residents group, and they're calling themselves the Skyliners. And they made a commitment to each other that they were going to, regardless of what happened, were going to support each other in the best ways that they could through their recovery. But not only that, they were going to get together as a group and look at preparing for the next bushfire season as a residents group at that neighbourhood level. Now there are now going to be regular Skyliners meetings with more people invited in, more services invited in. So step by step is inviting other services to come in, like Red Cross and Salvos and Habitat for Humanity, to have a cuppa and a cake and a bit of a chat with the Skyliners. So that's a really great example of how community orgs are really good at tapping into that pre-existing local capacity to get things moving. So we're really confident that when step by step steps back and we finish our work with the Skyliners, they're going to be fine. They're going to be well equipped to continue to support each other's recovery, but not only that, to support each other in preparing for the next bushfires at both a practical and a planning level. Now, Malacata Recovery Committee, now some of you I know are in East Gippsland, so you'd know more about this than me. But I just mentioned Malacata because I saw a story on them on ABC, and the story was titled "Rebellious Community Leads and Manages Their Own Disaster Recovery." And I thought, oh, shock horror, you know, these rebels without a cause. And basically, for those of you who don't know, Malacata is down the south coast, not the south coast, pardon me, in Victoria and East Gippsland. And they were very impacted by the bushfires. And you probably saw a lot of footage on the news about people sheltering on the beach as the fires came down. So Malacata basically has chosen to take control of their own bushfire recovery. So the town and surrounding districts have created their own incorporated body, which now has nearly 800 members in a town of 1,000. So that's pretty impressive. They formed a committee to apply for recovery grants, and they determine how the money is distributed to rebuild community infrastructure, including support and funding of those who lost their homes. So, and they will, you know, do all of the normal governance procedures and financial auditing around that. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll include a link to that particular story. But I'm just fascinated to see where a community's gone, no, we can do this faster, we can do this more efficiently, and I'm sure the local community orgs are very much connected and a part of the committee, if you like, or the organising body. So I just think there's some great things happening. That's what I mean. There's a new wave. There is change in the air. And we want to ensure that we tap into that, not only tap into it, but do what we can to support and resource that process of community-led recovery. So just very quickly, one of the Malacata committee members, Tanya, I really love this quote, says, if communities feel they are being listened to, if they're being consulted with, then I think that recovery process can hopefully happen a little bit more seamlessly and a lot more positively. I think it would be really good if local knowledge and local information informed emergency management practices before and after emergencies. And there's the link there to the ABC story. So you can have a good look at that yourself. I'm going to introduce Sarah and Pauline in just a minute, but I'm just going to finish my bit. So very quickly, potentially looking at the way ahead so that we are able to not just not be overwhelmed by the wave, but be part of the new wave and direct and drive it. So if communities and community organisations are prepared to acknowledge and accept their primary role in preparedness and recovery, so taking ownership, if communities can collectively, conduct an assets audit and assessment. So what do we already have to bring to this space? How can we bring this together? How can we collaborate together? What else do we need? Communities sharing recovery stories and lessons with each other. This is part of what we're doing today to inform preparedness and recovery planning. So what do we wish we had known or done or activated? What will we put in place for next time? So place-based local community orgs need to be recognised as first, second and third responders in terms of providing psychosocial disaster support. Government provides the necessary support, funding, training and capacity building resources. There is emergency surge capacity, which is included as either ancillary payments that sit alongside and within existing funding arrangements that they have with community orgs, or it's a button that can be pushed by the funders to provide an extension of existing funding for services in recognition of their role in supporting community during and after disasters, or funding arrangements are flexible enough to allow services to pivot, as Kris mentioned before, from core business to include psychosocial disaster recovery. So without further ado, because I really don't want to eat into Pauline and Sarah's time too much, they're my contact details there, but I'm sure Jamie will send those out to you. But I just wanted to quickly mention that I also designed a training program for community workers and community orgs and community volunteers called Walk With. And it was about really giving an orientation to disaster recovery and all of that stuff that we wish we had known before we got tapped on the shoulder to do disaster recovery back in 2013. So thank you for listening to me, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions that come from my little presentation. But without any further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to, first of all, we'll introduce you to Pauline Cook and Sarah Brian. Now, Pauline is from Monero, I pronounced that correctly, Pauline, Monero Family Support Service, and also now she's one of the 7 recovery support services. So she's also managing Snowy Monero Recovery Support Service, and you'll be hearing from her experience. And then when Pauline's finished, I'll introduce you and give you a little bit of background to Sarah Brian. So thanks, Pauline.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks so much, everybody. Anne's asked me to talk about how our experience as a small to medium-sized NGO that is a place-based NGO in the recovery space can be a kind of a case study about how we might be able to think about the design of recovery initiatives better in the future with community at the centre. And I guess our experience really highlights a lot of the things that Anne and Kris have been talking about. And we really had to stand our ground and make clear the kinds of things that we could do and that we were already doing to receive the role that we did eventually in the recovery space. So I'll tell you just a little bit about us. We are the main child, youth and family NGO in the Snowy Monero region. And we offer a stepped care model of support that promotes social emotional well-being and mental health for families throughout the region. Our staff are based in all the small communities, so we have a very well-established relationship infrastructure. People know us very well. We are the main and trusted service, and we really know how to engage with our community, how to work with them, how to address their needs and their concerns. And those ways of doing and that understanding has developed over a really long period in which that trust has been proven. While the fires in our area were still burning, we were already delivering crisis support and trauma-informed support to members of our community. We didn't wait, we just went and did it. We offered psychological first aid, disaster mental health support, counselling, crisis stabilisation for children, our case management and family support interventions that we already have as part of our spectrum of services were ongoing. They are strengths-based and solution-focused, so that was already there as a suite of programming that was available. All of those things are delivered via outreach, so we go to where people are. We don't wait for them to come to us. We try and reduce the barriers to help seeking however we can, and as our staff are embedded in all the different small communities of our region, that makes a big difference as well. We also quickly adapted our model of service delivery to add some specific bushfire responses. So we identified and procured some bushfire specific programs, and did a couple of extra bits of disaster mental health training to supplement that wraparound support that we already offered. All of that was delivered in the context of our existing funding, and in the context of the trauma-informed care that is a thread throughout all of our work. So when there was the announcements about the big additional mental health support that the government was going to provide as a result of the fires, we were quite excited. We thought we were very well positioned to maybe benefit from some of that because of the work that we were already doing. We had strong local support from our council and have had for a long time. We also made sure that our model was very well known in the area and with the emergency crisis organisations, but that did not lead to any, and I'm sure many of you listening today this will sound like a familiar experience. So that we were in the position where we were learning about more and more additional external services coming into our region with big dollars and new programs, and certainly none of it filtered down to us. We lobbied our MPs, and we did receive a small amount from them and from our local council to do some community resilience work. And we got a few little bits of our own bushfire grant money, but they were small. We received no additional resourcing to do the work we were already doing until July. And that was in the form of the recovery support service that Anne's already spoken about, funded by Resilience New South Wales. And to their credit, they were really willing to recognise that the work that we did was the work that that they were looking for, and that we were already doing that work. What I'd like to comment on today and to outline for you now is how we can think about the design of that recovery period and the planning of the initiatives better, so that services like us, who are already doing that work and who are the tried and trusted services in our community, don't have to fight so hard, don't have to elbow our way in, and can be recognised for the work that we do. So to do that, I'm suggesting, and I'll just share my screen here. Works, that we use an asset-based community development framework or principles, and that's been mentioned a few times in the presentation already today, and many of you will be familiar with it. But I just want to reflect on some of those principles and I guess compare them to our experience to show what actually did happen in our region. So with asset-based community development, it's very much a strengths-based approach, and it maximises community participation and ownership and really builds capacity at that local level. So one of the principles is that it has a focus on community assets and identifying those community assets. It has local organisations like ours and community at the centre. What happened in our experience was there was a focus on what was lacking in the community, and external services were just simply applied or inserted. And that's that sort of top-down approach. With asset-based community development, you really need to have that mapping of assets, of local capacities and organisations take place at the local level. Instead, what we found was that local organisations and local community were given no real opportunity to show their strengths, to demonstrate their strengths. We had to work really hard to have our voice heard, and so did community members. So without that community input into the recovery agenda, what you get is disengagement. Without that buy-in, people don't feel like they want to be a part of the recovery process, and so the outcomes for everyone become worse and worse. services, you also need to have principles where services that are needed are determined by the community themselves, and that the question that needs to be asked is, what do you think you need and how can we help? Instead, the question that was asked was, we'll tell you what you need. So that was very much what we found in our local area with the big influx of external services coming in. We'll tell you what you need and then you help us deliver it. I've got some other things there, and this document will be available to you all after. I won't go through them all, but there's also principles like the fact that asset-based community development is responsive and flexible and is able to mobilise local resources and knowledge really quickly. So that shortens resource demands, it sharpens the response time, and activities are able to be folded into the work that's already being done, like is the case with our service. What we saw were external services coming in that were inflexible and unable to accommodate local context. And this might sound really familiar to some of you. What we heard many times were things like, no, we don't do driveways, we don't do home visits, we only do telehealth. And that was in direct contrast to what people on the ground were saying they needed. There were lengthy implementation lead-in times. The external services had real trouble recruiting and no understanding of the local service landscape. And to obtain that kind of understanding, they actually had to added to our burden as the service with the community knowledge, because we were having to sort of facilitate that understanding of the local service landscape. So, that sort of secondary consultation role that we were performing still without being recognised for that, I think of as facilitation fatigue. So we were not resourced to do that, but we were having to do that to make sure that the community received the services that they deserved to receive. But that did lead to lots of anger and resentment amongst the community and increased the barriers to help seeking. So I've only been given 3 minutes, and I'm sure I've already gone over my 3 minutes. This document is here as a guide to, I think, or an example of how we could do that better, and how the principles of asset-based community development can really inform better design in the future if we want to achieve real ground-up community-led recovery and resilience in the long term. I think it is just vital to leverage those tried and trusted and safe relationships which already exist between community organisations like ours and our communities. And the alternative is that the uncertainty and stress that our community is already experiencing is only exacerbated, and I think we can do better than that next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. That was amazing. And look, Pauline and myself have only just really formally met in the last few weeks, really, as the recovery support services have been rolled out. But I just knew that you would want to hear her story. And congratulations to Pauline for advocating so strongly to be able to get the funding from Resilience New South Wales, which is excellent. And before I introduce Sarah, I just want to really quickly say this is another fantastic and very good argument for why community orgs need to be resourced so that their core business is expanded to include disaster recovery and disaster response. So I think, Pauline, has put together a very, very good argument for that. Now, the next wonderful person it's my pleasure and honour to introduce you to is Sarah O'Brien. And Sarah is the manager of Dungog Community Centre. And Sarah and myself first met up back in 2015, I think it was, Sarah, where Step by Step was just rolling up our project. in the Blue Mountains, and Sarah was just starting hers. And Sarah has another interesting story to share with everybody. And so I'll hand over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. And yes, you were just wrapping up your program when unfortunately we started to build ours and begin that process. And I'm really, really grateful as my staff and my community for the support that you gave us at that time. You really did give us guidance and reassurance, and really made me feel like sometimes I wasn't crazy, because you kind of really do feel like you're there a lot of the time in recovery. And so much of the experiences are so new and foreign and abnormal, but actually just to have that ear to know that actually others had gone this path and had felt the same, and that actually I was having a really, really natural, normal response to what was happening around me, as too was my community. So just that normalisation of that experience really did help take away some of the stress. And I think that sort of speaks a bit to what Evelyn was mentioning before in her question around how does a community actually lead its own recovery when it is so utterly fatigued. And I think that's where the drama program can come in and play a really great role in supporting all of us that are working in recovery to lean on each other, learn from each other's experiences, and draw strength from each other in those times when we don't feel like we have any of our own. Borrow someone else's for a while, because you'll be paying it back at some point. So it really has been wonderful to meet Chris and Anne, and I really look forward to talking more with Pauline. And yeah, it's wonderful. So look, yeah, we are still a very, very tiny 4 permanent part-time staff neighbourhood centre in the Hunter Valley in the New South Wales area. And we were a neighbourhood, and still are a neighbourhood centre. We also have a Centrelink agency attached to our centre, and we provide a range of supports for our community youth service and counselling, family support, and a number of programs. We also auspice a lot of community groups. We have a boomerang bags movement and a growers market, and a lot of other community-based programs. So we've been in the community for 40 years, really embedded and trusted by our community. We have really great partnerships and relationships throughout the community. And all of those are really lent upon extensively in 2015 when we were hit with a superstorm, an East Coast low, in the early hours of the 21st of April. And our community was devastated. As too was a lot of the Hunter, but Dungog just seemed to cop its unfair share. And very, very quickly, people literally left the floodwaters and turned up at the door of the community centre. Whether they'd received service from us before, whether they had participated in any of our programs or not, they turned to the community centre because we were that centre of trust and support and nurture and connect for the community. And it was overwhelming, really, in those first couple of days, the volume of people that came through. And but it was also heartwarming and incredibly humbling for our community to turn to us as an organisation in such a way for support. I now, sort of on reflection, I realised that at that time we were really the only organisation and structure operating in Dungog in that space that had absolutely no idea of the emergency management space and world that was existing around us. So while we were actually feeding, housing, clothing, supporting, counselling, caring for our community members, the combat agencies were all having a meeting down the road in a building about what we might do to support the community. And the community centre were not initially part of those conversations. And when we went and knocked on the door and asked if we could participate, no one in that room really understood why we would be there or what we had to offer, which at the time just completely angered me in such a way. But I now have understood that we weren't part of anyone's thinking or anyone's planning prior to the event. We weren't at the local emergency management committee. We weren't in the recovery plan. We weren't in the response plan. We'd never been thought of as a partner in this space by the powers that be. But the community didn't respond in that way. The community thought, well, of course the community centre will have the answers because they're the ones that support and care for us. So in our most vulnerable and most moment of most greatest need, the community centre will be there, and we were. It was very much, as Pauline has said, it was very much for us an extension of the programs we already offer. We're already doing trauma-informed practice. We're already supporting our community. We already had those relationships. We already had the staff and the volunteers that could work with our community in that way. We also had programs that we could extend. We have an emergency relief program, so we could extend that program. We had counselling services, which we could extend. We had the Centrelink agency, which we could extend. So we were already doing so much of the work, because so much of our work is about resilience building and capacity building. And so we just extended those programs and that support to the broader community. I think one of the key things for us in that was that there was no assessment in that sense from our perspective of who needed help. If someone presented and turned up at our door, that was enough for us, and we would support them. If someone put up their hand and said, actually, I need some help, we would help them. And I was speaking with a community in Victoria recently with Rob Gordon, and he mentioned and made note of some communities that he'd worked in that 2 years down the track, community members that had actually not been impacted as such, had not had fire or flood through their home, in their livelihood, in their lives, but actually it had happened in their community. 2 years down the track, community members that wouldn't have been deemed impacted were still having psychological distress from the event. And that was very much part of our approach, that there was no wrong door. Anyone could come to our community centre because this event happened in our community. And I remember having many conversations with people feeling quite guilty for their trauma that they felt because they didn't have water in their home. But it was actually that this had happened to their community, and that suddenly their home and their town wasn't as safe as they felt that it was. It didn't look the same, and they weren't sure how to process that, given that there were so many other people that they perceived to be in greater need. So that was actually something that really was about the whole of community and bringing everyone together and actually having that shared experience and legitimising everyone's experience and everyone's trauma and the way everyone reacted individually to that experience. So we moved through the recovery. We were fortunate to receive some funding through then OEM, Office of Emergency Management, now Recovery Resilience New South Wales. And we was funded similarly to Anne's step-by-step program, their first step-by-step program. And we got that funding. It came in 4 months after our flood. So for the day of the flood until we received funding for what we called Project Bounce Forward, our version of step-by-step, we were unfunded for any of the work that we were doing. So our centre was historically open 9 till 3, 4 days a week, and 9 to 1, 1 day a week. And we went to 9 to 5, 7 days a week. We had all of the staff, we had a number of volunteers that were working 6 days a week that our board felt were actually undertaking work that really required payment. It was beyond the capacity of a volunteer. So out of our reserves, our board started paying those staff, I think initially with the belief that the work that we were doing was so important to the recovery of the community, and evidently part of supporting people in their most vulnerable, that eventually and obviously that would be reimbursed because the work was of that nature, more fool us. So that wasn't reimbursed in any way, shape or form, and our organisation financially became extraordinarily shaky and very vulnerable 2 years after the flood, because we used all of our reserves to actually support the community in that time. So we received some funding, which was fabulous, and that was a 9-month program. We also partnered with a philanthropic organisation, NIB Foundation, and they funded community renewal, so that capacity building approach to recovery. And we were really fortunate to be able to employ a community development officer that worked alongside our caseworkers to do whole of community recovery. And I think that that was one of the greatest gifts that our recovery process actually had, was that we could couple community capacity building with case management and support, so that we had a holistic wraparound for our community. But we have now moved, we're now, you know, 5 years down the track, and we are still working in recovery with our community. We've now got the COVID overlay, but the other approach that we've taken is to really look at disaster preparedness for our community and how we can actually resource and strengthen our community for other events that may happen. And so we really lent upon our experience as a neighbourhood centre and as community organisations, and our approach has been to connect to community rather than actually having a specific fire plan or a specific flood plan, actually really building on those relationships of trust and connection that we turned to at our most vulnerable, so that we can actually make sure that we know who we can go to, what's a good source, trusted source of information, who can support me. If I've got a pet, do I know someone that I might be able to take my pet to a couple of days before the event is predicted to hit my area, so that I don't have to worry about my animal being safe, but I can actually make sure that we're already safe prior to the event. Rather than responding, we're actually taking actions to be prepared prior to the event. So we've been working around our relationships and our connections and our points of trust in community. And I know Anne spoke to trust before, and so did Kris, and it's an interesting theme that comes through. When we started working with the combat agencies and the local emergency management committee and the formal recovery committee that started, or when we started to try that relationship to begin with, there was no trust there between that combat agency group and the local emergency management committee to the community centre. And equally, probably there was very little trust from the community and the community centre back to those structures, because we'd actually never had any previous experience in communicating around disaster or response or caring for the community or networking. We didn't actually have that trust that is actually required to be nimble, to respond to the community, to adapt to the situation. So trust from the community to our organisation was imperative, but actually what was really lacking was the trust from the community and the community sector of our area through to the formal structures. We now actually have a really great working relationship with them, and that has seen a huge shift and a huge change. As Anne was saying, there have been small changes, and I had to keep holding on to your words, Anne, that there had been small changes. When I heard Pauline's story, I'm thinking, oh, those changes feel very, very small right now. But they are there, and they are happening. In the recent COVID experience, our council rang us straight away, started working out what we were doing, how they could support us, how they could connect us, asked me to support them in connecting the business sector and the community sector of our area in weekly catch-up meetings so that we could all work collaboratively together. So that was wonderful. And so at a local level, we are learning from our experiences and bringing changes in, which is fabulous. But I think as a sector-wide, we really do need to be, and Kris and I have spoken many times, it needs to be a whole approach to this space. So we all need to be partnering, our youth services, our family support services, and neighbourhood centres. Our whole sector needs to have one collective voice to really push forward the role that neighbourhood community and the community sector have in disaster resilience and in responding and in recovery, because we, as you've all said before, we are there before, we are there during, and we are there all of the years after. And we also need to make sure that us as organisations remain strong throughout that time. It's a very exhausting process in working in recovery, but also as my organisation discovered, we became financially very, very unstable 2 years after the event, which we had not foreseen at all. We've always been a really financially viable organisation, and we are there now, but it was very, very scary for some time. So we really do need to make sure that as an organisation, we are actually prepared to respond, that we know what that will look like for our staff, for our workers, for our volunteers, and also for the organisation, both practically but also financially, because our community needs us to remain in their community for many years to come. It's not just this one disaster that we're facing now. We need to be there always and every day for all of the little disasters that impact on all of the lives in our communities, not just the one collective that we may be responding to right now. So look, thank you very much for the opportunity of talking. It was just so wonderful to hear Anne and Kris. I've heard them many times and I could hear them over and over and over, and it was just so wonderful to hear Pauline's story. So thank you so much for sharing, Pauline. It was beautiful to hear your passion and your capacity and resilience. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I just do a really quick plug? Walk With, which is a resource that I put together after my first experience in recovery, features Sarah and Kris, and they're sharing their pearls of wisdom and hard-won experience on the resource. So you get to actually hear from people who've been there and done that. So lovely to hear from you again, Sarah.
Thank you, Anne and Sarah and Pauline and Kris. It's been really wonderful to hear your experiences and for you to be able to share them with our attendees. I'm very conscious that we've got about 12 minutes left. There have been a couple of questions, a couple of really great comments, but I'll focus on the questions. Natalie mentioned that COVID has increased a lot of challenges for how organisations are engaging. Usually they do a lot of face-to-face, come in for a tea or a chat, informal gatherings, and they can't do them because of COVID. So she was wondering how other organisations or recovery groups are managing this. Have they suspended their activities due to COVID? Are they pressing on ahead in the virtual space? So how are you approaching some of this?
Well, from step-by-step experience, I'll be brief so Pauline can talk about what she's putting in place. Look, essentially, as soon as in New South Wales, as soon as the Premier said that 2 adults could visit 1 adult in their home, we got out there back on the road. Prior to that, we were basically desperately trying to connect with people via telephone, online, snail mail, any way that we could. But as soon as we were allowed to get out there, we started commencing having what we call chats over the fence. So essentially we're physically distancing, we're still doing that, but we are meeting people, and sometimes we're meeting outside their favourite cafe, or it could be on their damaged property, but we have chats over the fence. We take our hand sanitisers, we take our gloves, our masks, everything like that. Where possible, if we are connecting with people who fall into those vulnerable groups, we try and connect with them over the phone. So we're basically still an outreach service, but just with those extra added precautions. So Pauline, do you want to share what you're doing?
Yes, very similar to yours, and I'll just touch on the community engagement event side of our work. With that, though that did cease for a while, we are back doing that and managing that. We've tried running a few events outside, but it's very cold in the mountains in winter. So we need to run them by means of a registration process. So people, the drop-in events are hard to manage. If it's just an open door, even though that can work really well, you don't know how many people you'll get through at any one time, whether you'll get a spike and then no one. So we have to actually ask people to register so that we can manage the numbers of people coming through.
Great, thank you both.
And I think a lot of our Blue Mountains service organisations are also doing quite a bit in the virtual space. So our youth sector organisation has reported, for example, that the moment young people were allowed to reconnect with their youth worker, they would come in to see them, you know, in an outdoor cafe or whatever it was, and basically burst into tears and dissolve. And they were waiting. They'd been doing the telehealth model, the virtual, but they were waiting for the actual face-to-face. So while we do the virtual as often as we can, we're having virtual play groups and whatever it might be, there's nothing that really replaces that face-to-face. And I'm sure Anne and Pauline are both nodding. Yeah.
Great, thanks Chris, that's such a good point. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are probably finding in the work that they're doing, is that that face-to-face interaction just cannot be replaced. I just wanted to highlight, there aren't any more questions that I can see, but somebody did ask around if there has been a community survey on the issues and topics for a baseline, and if that's repeated, as it would be interesting to sort of understand how communities, particularly if they've previously experienced a disaster, what their response was the next time round. I don't believe there has been a survey as such, but in terms of surveys for community services, a couple of comments mentioned that the LCSA and NCOS have both put out surveys for community service organisations. Though there is a comment that there's 309 questions in the NCOS survey, which puts some good time aside if you're going to do that one.
And I think, Jess, the National Bushfire Recovery Agency has done, not everybody involved in every community organisation, but they've gone out to, I think Anne and I, at least, and I'm sure Sarah would have been involved in their survey earlier in the year, trying to get, you know, a snapshot of, take the pulse of the recovery organisations who are out there in terms of what was needed on the ground. And there's a report out from them which is worth a read as well.
Thanks, Chris. I'll also highlight that Resilience New South Wales and Services New South Wales, in partnership with local councils, starting in the southeast of New South Wales, have been doing a survey to do a bit of a needs assessment. And they have been following that up with phone calls, and there is a plan to roll that out in other bushfire impacted areas in New South Wales. And that's trying to understand some of the issues and how people feel that they and their community are recovering. For me, one of the key things that's really come out is about how people have would like to be engaged, or what they think is the best method. And 80% of the respondents so far have actually said that putting stuff in physical mail has been really helpful, and Facebook has then come in quite high as well. I think people, as they're adapting to the COVID environment, that's been one of their one of the things. I know we're running short on time. There's a question that's just come in. How do you engage with rural and remote communities who, by their nature of why they live, where they live, don't normally engage with community organisations?
I'll give a quick answer to that one, then hand it over. But just to follow up with what you were saying, in many of the locations in parts of the Hawkesbury that we're working in, people have very limited or no mobile network coverage. They have very limited or no internet, and in many cases have no physical letterbox. So basically the only way to get to these people, and these are the people 8 months down the track who are only now just popping their hands up to say, I lost my home. So the only way to connect with these people is by actually driving out there and doing door knocks and things like that, and just connecting face to face. So, and in many cases, I think to answer that question is that many of these people in these communities were living in off-grid situations. They chose to live in remote areas because they don't necessarily want to connect closely with community, and they really value their privacy. And so connecting with them has been very much one-to-one. That is what they've been most comfortable with. They don't want to come along to community events. And particularly from their point of view, what we've been hearing from people is, I don't want to share my story in public. I don't want other people to hear what's happening for me. So they are much more comfortable with just one-to-one working with the one worker, who can then link them up with other services when and if they feel comfortable to do that. That's the approach we're using.
Yeah, look, we took, sorry, Pauline, you can go.
I was just going to say just the importance of going to meet people where they are, and I mean that both physically and in every other way, to meet them on their own terms, and to use persistence and patience and understanding, going to visit them, and chat to them over the fence, chat to them in the yard, go to the fire shed, you really need to get out there, get on the ground and develop those relationships. Social media, mobile phones, limited use. I think it's the real people contact that makes the real difference.
Yeah, look, absolutely, I would second that most definitely. The other thing that we also did in our rural community was if the vet had the relationship with a farmer or someone that wasn't actually wanting to connect, why force that person to build a relationship with our organisation? So we actually just worked with vets, we worked with our local stock agent, we worked with a number of those key figures that actually had, and Department of Primary Industry, rural resilience workers, and whoever that family was connected to or that person was connected to, we actually let them be the information feed rather than actually enforcing another relationship upon someone. And that worked really, really well. They would invite us for the cuppa, so that we could be that, develop trust through another trusted source rather than trying to build it on your own. And mail for us was also really great. We did a lot of billets that didn't look like a support service. It was just some information and tried to keep it, just very, very neutral. And that seemed to take, a lot of people took that offer up as well through that medium.
Agreed, Sarah. We have made connections with people through their neighbours. So the neighbours, would go, hey, I've met with Michelle. She's really good. She's coming over next week. Why don't you just pop in for a quick cuppa? And then you can see what you think. So I think those sorts of informal community connections are really vital as well.
Thank you. Thank you all. I know for us, and it's one of the things that you talked about was around those community leaders that exist within communities and how you engage with them. For Red Cross, in some areas, it's been that there's been one person on a street and they themselves have said, the people in my area, we live here because we wanted to be alone. And so we work with that person, we share resources with them, and they actually go and distribute them to their neighbours. And so that's, for us, it's just been about that one person that said, I'd like to know more and I want to share it with my neighbours. So yeah, I feel that often it's a case-by-case sort of basis for how you do that work.
And this is where community orgs are so well placed. We have that flexibility. That is our approach. We're able to innovate in situ to meet community preferences and residents' choices.
Thank you. Very conscious of the time. I wanted to thank Anne, Pauline, Sarah and Kris for your time today, and thank you everyone who's attended. I'll hand back over to Jamie now, who will wrap us up.
I will indeed. Thank you so much, Jessie. And also, I just wanted to acknowledge everyone and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We hope you have enjoyed today's session. A special thanks to our guests, Kris, Anne, Pauline and Sarah, and a huge thank you to Jessie for facilitating today's webinar. And so just a reminder that the webinar was recorded and we will send you a link to the recording, all of the resources mentioned in today's session, as well as a survey just seeking your feedback just to help us improve our content and our delivery. Now listen, one of the big themes that has come through is around connection and sharing of information. So if you are on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to join us over at the Disaster Recovery Practitioners Australia group. And again, I'll include that as a part of your email so that you can link it there just to continue the conversation. Now, the purpose of that group is just to share information about the practice of disaster recovery for community members, local government, local organisations, schools, businesses, amongst others, because there are many people that are going to face being a recovery manager for the very first time, even if disaster recovery is nowhere near their job title. Now, Australian Red Cross, as I mentioned, also leads the Disaster Recovery Australia Disaster Recovery Advisors Mentors Australia program, and that's aimed at supporting communities impacted by disasters and able to drive their own recovery. So we link trained volunteer mentors like our wonderful Kris Newton and Sarah O'Brien, who have previous personal experience in disaster recovery with community workers and leaders. So you may be a recovery officer, a school principal from local council, or a leader in the community services organisation, and you're currently in the midst of recovery, and it's just a way of discussing and addressing challenges that may be posed by the disaster recovery process. The mentoring also aims to help community leaders avoid the unnecessary pitfalls of recovery, normalise the recovery experience, and equally share their experience, provide support, and act as a sounding board. Now listen, if you are interested for further information on this program, which I'm the coordinator of, please email me at recovery@redcross.org.au. As I mentioned, this was a series, one of a series of webinars supporting the sector. So please keep an eye out on the Red Cross website for upcoming webinars. Until next webinar, thank you so much and goodbye. Thank you, everyone.